Khalilzad, he served as U.S. Ambassador to Iraq, Afghanistan, and the United Nations. Ambassador, great to see you again.
Great to be with you.
As we just heard from our correspondent there, this battle goes back and forth. One day Islamic State captures a town, the next day they lose the town. But whatever the case, they still occupy a significant chunk of territory across Syria and Iraq. To what do you owe their power and rise?
You're right that they do hold a substantial amount of territory, including cities like the second largest Iraqi city, Mosul. And recently, of course, we know in Anbar what happened. And I think this shows that they have support, both in the areas where they are and from outside. We know that there are foreign fighters from all over the world who have joined them, but also it is plausible, I think indeed it's likely that they get support from some of the states, the intelligence agencies of some of the states in that region.
And they seem to get significant support from other places in the world. Libya, there's almost a branch of Islamic State there. Boko Haram has pledged allegiance to Islamic State as well.
Right. Well, I believe that the rise of Islamic State is the product of two crises. One is the Shia-Sunni crisis, the struggle over Iraq and Syria, where on the one hand, sits a government that's supported by Iran is Shia-dominated in both countries, and the majority are Sunni Arabs in Syria, but there are a significant minority in Iraq. They feel disenfranchised, and in addition, there is the Iranian dimension in support of the government in Baghdad and in Syria. And there are Arab Sunni governments who feel both on a sectarian basis as Sunnis and also on geopolitical level as rivals of Iran. They want to block Iran's influence, Iran's domination. And some, I think, support even ISIS in order to prevent Iran from consolidating control all the way from Iran to the Mediterranean Sea, with Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq standing in the way.
Right, very complex. Now, the United States is making yet another effort to counter Islamic State. President Obama announced that 450 advisors will be sent to the region to train Iraqi fighters. Let's take a listen to what Ash Carter, the current Defense Secretary, said before a congressional committee on Wednesday here in Washington. Let's watch this.
Our training efforts in Iraq have thus far been slowed by a lack of trainees. We simply haven't received enough recruits. Of the 24,000 Iraqi security forces we had originally envisioned training at our 4 sites by this fall, we've only received enough recruits to be able to train about 7,000, in addition to 2,000 counterterrorism service personnel. As I've told Iraqi leaders, while the United States is open to supporting Iraq more than we already are, we must see a greater commitment from all parts of the Iraqi government.
So there we have the United States government saying that it's open to supporting Iraq, but they don't seem to be getting the response they want from the Iraqi side.
I think that what is happening in Iraq is with the disintegration of the armed forces, particularly we saw it in Mosul, and we also saw it in Ramadi more lately. It is clear that with the politicization of the army that occurred perhaps in the latter part of Mr. Maliki's government after the U.S. withdrawal, that army largely disintegrated, and now it is being rebuilt. But with the urgent crisis or threat of ICE, the force that is really being relied on by the government is the militia forces, who exceed 200,000 in number. Various forces with different names, from Badr to similar to a name of the Lebanese group Hezbollah, to a whole range of others, some with direct connections to Iran, some with indirect connection. They are really the force that is leading on the battlefield. And the Peshmerga, of course, the Kurdish forces in the north who have done a good job defending their areas and perhaps going beyond. So I think the buildup of the army is a long-term project. In the near term, it is the militias and the Peshmerga who are doing the heavy lifting on the fight against ISIS. But that poses a dilemma of itself, because the militias are Shia, largely, going into Sunni areas. And I'm sure the effect is not all positive, because some Sunnis fear these militias and may support the ISIS.
It becomes a sectarian war. Now, the United States tells us that ISIL poses a threat to the U.S. Can the U.S. win this battle without sending in ground forces, so-called boots on the ground?
Well, I think it will be difficult to win. We can contain it with the current level of effort. You know, as you said, they win some, they lose some, so you can make sure they don't take over Baghdad or some other major city. But to win it in a timely fashion, and it's a matter of a year or two, let's say, you will need to have forces on the ground. But in order to make sure that that win is sustained, because we won the war against Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is the antecedent of the ISIS. When I was in Baghdad as ambassador, we had Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and we managed to kill Zarqawi, was the head of Al-Qaeda in Iraq.
But isn't this a group that grew out of that?
It is, and that's precisely my point.
Yeah.
That you can win, but to sustain that win, you need to have Sunni Arabs, in the case of Iraq, feeling that they are part of the government, that they will side with the government, and you need non-sectarian policies, and you need maybe for some time a U.S. presence to make sure the evolution takes place in the right direction. Our pullout led to polarization inside Iraq,
right.
Regional powers coming in on different sides, and we know what the results have been.
What about addressing the underlying issues in the region? The United States at one time, President Obama, drew a red line when it came to Bashar al-Assad. He said that if Assad goes ahead and uses chemical weapons, he will not be left alone by the United States. And then the U.S. withdrew from that threat. The other issue is that the United States has been trying to put pressure on the central government in Baghdad to say you have to have a more inclusive government. You have to bring Sunnis in, show them that they have a role in governing this country.
Sure.
That hasn't happened.
No, and I think that the U.S. role is not what it used to be, and the role of regional players has increased significantly. Iran has become much more important in affecting developments in Iraq and Syria. Turkey and Saudi Arabia are the other big regional players, and the crisis has become increasingly sectarian and regional rivalry along sectarian lines. And in order to have a lasting stability or a lasting solution, you need an understanding and agreement between the regional players representing the different sects on power sharing and a regional arrangement that's conducive to stability. Unless an outside power comes in with massive force, and then you're talking about huge forces, not 10, 20,000, I believe at most you can be a balancer to make sure things do not get out of control, but you can't solve it. The solution must now come from Shia and Sunni leaders accepting each other as legitimate branches of Islam, and a balance of power or an arrangement regionally, whether it's a new regional grouping. I mean, remember ASEAN at one time was a dysfunctional region. This was called the Balkans of Asia at one time. And post-Vietnam, then they came together, showed wisdom, and formed an organization called ASEAN, which helped with stability and economic progress. This region is not ready for that. It's a long way from that. But there must be a vision for how the region can get itself in a better position than it is right now.
Okay, very quickly, Ambassador, because we're running out of time, but we can probably trace back the current situation and the emergence of groups like Al-Qaeda in Iraq, like ISIL, etc., to the 2003 invasion of Iraq by the United States. You served in that administration, you served in diplomatic posts in that administration. Looking back now, was that a mistake?
Well, I mean, I think that as far as the tracing back, I'll come to the mistake part, but as far as the tracing back is concerned, you could trace it back to the crisis within Islamic civilization. The United States didn't cause the Shia-Sunni split that has been there for, of course, hundreds of years.
Right.
And the United States was not responsible for regional rivalry, again, Arab versus Persian versus Turk, that has struggled. Baghdad has changed hands between Turks and Iranians, if you go back in the history of the world. And Islamism, the revolution in Iran could be in part credited, if you like, with the rise of some Islamic movement. Hezbollah has been there. And, you know, in Afghanistan, you can trace it back to even earlier period to the Soviet invasion. Right. So the origins is very complex. But I think that certainly if we knew what we know now about WMD, I think there clearly would have been a mistake to go in if we knew that Iraq did not have WMD, that everyone assumed they did.